initially expected. And so overall, the effects on crop prices was, very mixed. And so initially, crop prices, after the 2007 period really, rose in 2008, 2012. But then over time, those prices came down because yields increased, there was better use of land. And so, of course, this is just looking at kind of, before and after, so it's not totally sorting it out. But there has been a lot of research suggesting that overall the increase in crop prices that could be attributed to biofuels on average would be about 15 to 20% or so. So not entirely, all of the increase was not due to biofuels, and it was partly mitigated by this increase in supply that did take place. The other evidence that we also see is that there was a significant reduction in the cost of producing corn ethanol, and that a lot of that could be attributed to the policy that really led to this huge increase from about 3-4 billion gallons to 15 billion gallons that led to learning by doing. And so this is a learning by doing curve that shows how the price of processing corn ethanol declined, and this would not have happened if we didn't have a policy that was really pushing the technology to increase beyond what might have been possible otherwise. And then both the RFS and the LCFS, for various reasons, and different reasons actually, have led to an increase in advanced biofuel production, and in particular, this renewable diesel, which did not exist until very recently. And in fact, now, the LCFS, much of this initial, increase in renewable diesel was from non-land-based sources. It was from waste, food waste, municipal waste, and, used cooking oil, and so on. So those were all new innovations that were driven because of that policy. Over time, the efficiency of producing corn ethanol has also grown, in that the amount of energy output to energy input ratio has been increasing, again, stimulated by the need to be more cost competitive, and given this assured demand for this fuel. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which these policies influence the mix that is being used to meet them, and the type of biofuels that get produced respond very much to the incentives that are given in the policy. So in particular, the renewable fuel standard, while it set these volumetric goals, had a nested structure, which basically meant that biodiesel could actually meet a part of the total renewable fuel requirement. So biodiesel could displace corn ethanol if it were a lower cost fuel to do that. And so this was this nested structure of the RFS, and it had this unintended, but may not have been fully thought through effect, which is that one of the ideas was that with the biofuel policy and these ambitious mandates, we would be able to consume higher blends of ethanol, so that we'd go to not only E10, which is what we are currently using, but we'd actually be able to move to E85, and therefore have a greater share of our transportation fuel being met by corn ethanol. But actually what happened is that we've been stuck at the E10. So even despite this ambitious policy, the policy itself was not able to push the demand. It didn't create the demand for higher blends of ethanol. And part of the reason for doing that is because this nested structure of the RFS limited the incentives for the blenders to sell higher blends of ethanol at a price that was at energy parity with E10. So E85 sold in the US actually has been costing about 15% more than E10, even though it has less energy content than E10. And instead, this nested structure of the policy led the biofuel blenders to blend more biodiesel with biodiesel, because biodiesel was supported by a tax credit. It was a cheaper way to meet the mandate. There was also an indirect benefit due to the cellulosic biofuel waivers that came about because no cellulosic biofuels were produced. So together, these two policies led to more biodiesel production, and they kind of had the corn ethanol plateau out at less than 15 billion gallons, and the blend walls stay at about E10. So we haven't had the E85 that was intended, and instead we've had more biodiesel. Now the LCFS also led to more biodiesel production, because biodiesel is less carbon intensive than corn ethanol. And so you can see that did it for different reasons, and that was to lower the carbon intensity at a relatively lower cost. And again, with the biodiesel tax credit, it was more cost effective to do so. So you can see from here that the amount of corn ethanol over time has been declining. Biodiesel began to increase, and this particularly this green portion, which is the renewable diesel, has really taken off in a big way. And that much of the renewable diesel produced has actually gone to California, because that was needed in order to meet the LCFS in a more cost-effective way. The policy also kind of led to the spatial shift, and knowing that because California's standard was based on carbon intensity and not just renewable fuel, the higher carbon intensity fuels were consumed elsewhere in the country, and the lower carbon intensity fuel was used in California. So actually having this state-specific policies actually can just lead to this shift from one place to another, and does not necessarily lower carbon intensity everywhere. And so that's one of the limitations of having different policies in different parts of the country, instead of having a uniform, like a national low carbon fuel standard. Now, all of that sort of sounds good in the sense that biodiesel is less carbon intensive. It's produced from soybean, which is unlike corn, which requires less nitrogen, and so there are some benefits to that. But this biodiesel is increasingly while initially was produced from tallow and used cooking oil and things like that, of late now, as the demand for biodiesel has increased, is increasingly being produced with soybeans. And so currently soybeans, about 50% of the soybeans that are produced are actually being used for biodiesel. 40% of the corn that is produced is being used for biodiesel. So large shares of our current food crops are being used for that. This raises concerns about land use change. So when you're diverting all of this, it raises crop prices to some extent, even though it may be 15-20% over time. But it certainly creates a perception that it has a potential to lead to a lot of land use change, and in that process release carbon that is stored in the native soils and vegetation, and create indirect land, carbon debt that could take many years to pay back simply through the savings by displacing fossil fuels in the U.S. So I'm going to just briefly talk about a study that was just published last year, looking at the extent to which, this is in the U.S. context, looking at the extent to which land use change was caused by corn and soybean for ethanol and biodiesel. And what we try to do here is, really take it's a backcasting approach. So we're trying to look at, over the period 2007 to 2018, firstly, can we validate our model so that it's actually able to predict what actually happened, and then use that to develop a counterfactual to say what would have happened without the biofuels and what happened with biofuels, and then attribute the difference and figure out how much that was. And so in particular, we also wanted to look at the extent to which the reduction in the Conservation Reserve Program by about 10 million acres over the same time period was due to biofuel-induced increase in prices. We use this integrated model called BPAM. That's an open economy, multi-sector partial equilibrium model. And so this sort of shows the validation of the model. It shows how well the model can actually predict the reduction that took place in the CRP, even accounting for changes in the Farm Bill and all of that, over this period between 2007 2018. And then this shows the level of the land use change that would have happened over this period, without biofuels, and then the additional loss of CRP that happened because of biofuels. And so with that, about 40% or so of the reduction in CRP could in fact be attributed to corn ethanol, and about 10% of the reduction was the additional impact of adding soy biodiesel production in addition to the corn ethanol mandate that was there. So, there was some significant portion, but not entirely, all of the land use change was not entirely due to biofuels, but there was a significant component of that. Now, of course, when we convert this into per acre, so if we want to see, well, per gallon or per billion gallons of biofuels, what does the land use change look like? We find that it's about like 0.5 million acres are needed per billion gallons of biofuel. Depending on assumptions we make about which type of land can be converted, but really the model suggests it's this black line, which is fairly consistent with this box plot here, which is sort of showing the median estimate. If you take all of the studies across and put them all together, you're roughly at about 500,000 acres per billion gallons is what's needed for corn ethanol. In the case of biodiesel, it actually turns out to be twice as large, and so that's sort of one of the issues, is that or about 0.78, and so maybe about 50% as large as compared to corn ethanol. So biodiesel is much more land intensive, and that kind of raises concerns about how much biodiesel can continue to expand without having more negative impacts on prices and land use and so on. So if we convert that into what does that mean for greenhouse gas intensity? And so we do this Monte Carlo estimate to look at a range of different parameters and assumptions and so on, and figure out, well, this is the amount of the indirect land use change, and which on average is about 0.5, but you have a big range depending upon various assumptions, the model and the data. And based on that, you can calculate, what happens to the carbon intensity, and then really how much does corn ethanol save carbon emissions, taking into account both the direct and indirect effects and so on. And so on average, we find that, it's about 36% saving relative to gasoline, but could range between, say, 20 to 40% depending upon various assumptions. And then moving on to what does that mean for, if we were to continue this corn ethanol mandate at about 15 billion gallons until, say, 2030, what would be the total reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because of that? And so we sort of project out to the future, and we find that it would reduce emissions by about 3%, in 2030. So it would have some effect, but a fairly modest impact. We also use the same model then to say, okay, what if we were to have that 16 billion gallons added on by 2030? What would the benefit of that be? And and that kind of by 2030 would lead to a much greater reduction. So you could have about 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2030, and about 6.5% cumulative reduction over this time over the next the next decade or so by implementing that policy. Also, in terms of the indirect land use change, which has sort of been the one big Achilles heel for biofuels, it will be much, much smaller compared to corn ethanol. So this is sort of what it was for corn ethanol. For cellulosic biofuels, I mean, the scale is completely different here, so it would be a fraction of the indirect effect, because these cellulosic biofuels are much more productive, can be grown on less productive land, and they are also much more higher yielding, and so a number of reasons why they would have a much smaller carbon footprint than corn ethanol. Now, of course, one of the challenges is they're very costly to produce, and the technology is not quite there, it's not commercially viable yet for their production. And then the other is that, despite these benefits of greenhouse gas savings, they do come with a significant welfare cost, at least in the near term, because they're more expensive than gasoline. And it is a policy constraint that is causing them to be produced. And so, the cost of corn ethanol, the welfare cost of corn ethanol production, continuing this policy up to 2030 is about $200 per metric ton of CO2 to get that 3% reduction. This should be corn plus cellulosic. With corn plus cellulosic, the costs are somewhat lower because of the lower impact on food prices because of the cellulosic ethanol mandate, but still, $150 per metric ton. So both of these are significantly higher than the social cost of carbon. And just using that as a metric would, make you question whether or not it is worth continuing. But then one has to take, of course, long-run benefits, the long-run climate benefits, and the expectation that ultimately these could actually become fully competitive with corn ethanol and be the solution to get us off fossil fuel use. So just some of the key takeaways is that policy really matters in terms of the type of innovation that it will induce. And even though we talk about biofuels and we talk about low carbon renewable energy, renewable energy by itself that doesn't focus on carbon leads to very different outcomes than renewable low carbon policies. When you have the carbon intensity performance standard, it's going to really lead to low carbon biofuels, whereas a renewable energy policy by itself leads to renewable fuels that are the lowest cost but not necessarily the lowest carbon intensive. So design of policies, it matters. Looking at just having supply side policies and expecting that that is going to, the technology push is also enough to make sure that we actually begin consuming it is also misleading, because as shown by the renewable fuel standard, we could not get past that blend wall simply based on the design of that policy. Second generation biofuels, there's quite a bit of evidence they are much greater environmental benefits, not only in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, but other ecosystem services, nutrient loss reduction, and so on. But there are a lot of technological challenges to their production. But then we have to also recognize that technology development is slow. It took the corn ethanol industry decades. I mean, this started in the 70s, and it didn't become even really mature until there was such a major policy push. So one needs many decades before these kind of policies actually really induce and lead to a mature industry with these new technologies. And so there requires a lot of patience to wait for for this to happen. All right, so I'm going to stop with that and